Okay, so now it is my great pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Robert Bruggeman. Bob is a historian and critic of architecture, landscape, preservation, urban development, and the built environment. He received his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania and joined the faculty of the University of Illinois at Chicago, where he was distinguished university professor and in art history, architecture, urban planning, and policy when he retired in 2009. He's also taught at the University of Pennsylvania, the Philadelphia College of the Arts, MIT, and Columbia University, and has worked for the Historic American Buildings Survey and Historic American Engineering Record of the National Park Service. Bob Bruggeman is the author or editor of numerous books and articles. Among the books are Benicia, Portrait of an Early California Town, Modernism at Mid-Century, The Architecture of the United States Air Force Academy, The Architecture of Holabird and Roche and Holabird and Root, an illustrated catalog of work, The Award-Winning Architects in the City, the controversial Sprawl, A Compact History, and most recently, The Architecture of Harry Weiss. He's also a frequent lecturer, contributor to magazines and blogs, and guest of radio and television. We are thrilled that you are here, Bob, after 3 years of planning and 2 years of waiting out the pandemic. Welcome to Kalamazoo.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Diane. Very pleased to be here in Kalamazoo. What I wanted to do tonight is talk a little bit about this book, which came out in 2018. Seems like decades ago now. Around 2012, the Chicago Art Deco Society invited me to write an introduction to this book, which I thought I could knock out in a weekend. And instead, what happened was I somehow morphed into being editor and having to corral some 40-some authors to do essays in this book. And so it took about 6 years. But I don't regret any of this time because it was a real voyage of discovery for me. I mean, I thought I knew something about design in Chicago, but it turned out that there was an awful lot that I didn't know. By the way, were we going to turn the lights down a little bit, at least the ones here in front? So I thought I'd tell you a little bit about what I learned about design in Chicago, particularly between the two world wars, but also some things that we still don't know. Okay, so here I am. When I arrived at the University of Illinois at what was then Chicago Circle in the late 1970s, an eager beaver young architectural historian. And on my arrival, I found that there was a really strong consensus about what the architectural or design history of Chicago was. It was almost all about architecture. And it went something like this. It was a play in 3 acts. There was act number 1, the so-called Chicago School, Daniel Burnham, Louis Sullivan, people of that sort in the 1880s, 1890s. Act 2, this terrible interlude with the Chicago World Fair of 1893, which set back architecture for 50 years, supposedly. And then Act 3, where Salvation, Mies van der Rohe, comes to Chicago and brings European avant-garde. So this was the narrative that was in place when I got there. This narrative had been around for a while. It had been codified in the 30s and 40s by people like Nicholas Pevsner and Siegfried Gideon. And it was a narrative about the avant-garde. Avant-garde meaning in military terms, the people that go ahead, the scouts, to see what was up there. And the avant-garde of Europe in the 1920s was decidedly left-wing, anti-bourgeois, anti-middlebrow. And so they wrote the whole history based on that. And the great gods at the time were Gropius, Mies, Le Corbusier, the Bauhaus. Now, this history followed the history of art, which had followed exactly the same trajectory. So in the 19th century, we had the Impressionists, then Cézanne, and then Picasso and abstraction in art. And then finally, the center of the world moved to New York and the abstract expressionists and Jackson Pollock. This is a history of the avant-garde, a history of people who were creating things that were supposedly new, not dependent on any anything before them, any precedents, any historical recollection. So this narrative was very popular in Chicago, and I think you can understand why. You can understand why, because this would have been, meaning Chicago, because it had these buildings in the 1890s, and then when the European architects came over and saw that it was very similar in appearance, at least in fuzzy photographs, to what they were doing in the 1920s, Chicago got the reputation as being the birthplace of modern architecture and the birthplace of the skyscraper. Now, the birthplace of the skyscraper was just dead wrong for all kinds of reasons, but that's a story for another time. But come back to this business about being the birthplace of modern architecture. This claim was put forward most forcefully by a man named Carl Condit. He's a professor at Northwestern. And you can see that history right on the cover of his famous book in 1964, The Chicago School of Architecture. There's the 1880s, 1890s on the left, and there on the right is the so-called Second Chicago School, the steel and glass stripped down buildings of the post-war period on the right-hand side. Now, when I got to Chicago in the late 1970s, I took one look around and realized that something was really wrong with this story. First of all, those Chicago buildings, like the Marquette building there on the right-hand side, or Louis Sullivan's buildings, were not unornamented. They did not turn their back on history. They did not remove all of the historic references. That guilloche pattern, the Greek fret on the doors, all of this suggested that while these programs were new, bigger than the things that had ever been seen before, they essentially were still trying to make them as classical as they could be. The other thing that I noticed, and in some ways even more revealing to me, was all the things that weren't in those books. And here's one of them. The Civic Opera building of the late 1920s. Amazingly to me, these buildings were described as only half modern, that they didn't go all the way toward abstraction and creating something new. They were using all kinds of historic ornament. And so they were written out, that they weren't part of this progression of avant-garde movements that would lead up to the absolutely simple, minimal steel and glass buildings of the 1950s and 1960s. But it was deeper than just style, because for people like Gropius, for Gideon, for Pevsner, for Carl Condit, these buildings were decadent. In fact, there was a critic that called this the perfume bottle style of architecture. And it was pretty clear what this was about. The target of this epithet was clearly French-inspired Art Deco, with its associations of a life of superficial glamour, luxury, drinking, and sex. Nothing like the manly erections of the great Chicago architects. So for decades, the Palmolive building was considered a backwater in architectural history, hardly mentioned in these books. And this I found just to be absolutely astonishing. It was all based on this notion that starting something completely new, afresh, new vocabulary is somehow inherently better than working with a vocabulary that already exists, as if new thoughts couldn't be expressed with old words. In any case, for decades, this building was hardly mentioned, while this building, just a little villa on the outside of Paris, got all the attention. And it's still, to this day, despite all my work, considered the mainstream of modernism, rather than, for example, this, which for most Americans, most people anywhere in the world, in fact, in the time it was built and for many years thereafter, was considered the mainstream of modernism. This was the greatest complex at the heart of the greatest city in the world. But like the Palmolive building, this was all written out. You barely find it in those textbooks on modernism. Or this. So the first thing I did when I got to Chicago was I looked around to see what I thought was really interesting in the way of architecture that had been overlooked. And the biggest set of buildings were the buildings from between the wars, and particularly the great buildings of the late 1920s, like the Board of Trade there. And the greatest purveyor of these buildings was the firm of Halliburton and Root. The firm had been founded as Halliburton and Roach in the 1880s. By the 1920s, it was Halliburton and Root, and they were one of the largest, most prestigious architecture firms in the country at the time. So I did a catalog, a 3-volume catalog of their works. There was an exhibition at the Chicago Historical Society. Later, I did a text volume that took the story up to 1919. I'm working right now on the volume that will go from 1919 to 1945. I also spent a lot of time talking about Halliburton and Root and lecturing on them. Now, at these gatherings, something very peculiar would happen. I'd be right in the middle of the talk, and suddenly I'd hear this voice from the front row. "Did you say Art Deco?" And it was a little old lady in this purple coat with a little bunny on her pin on her coat. I later learned that this was a woman named Bunny Selig, who was a member of the Chicago Art Deco Society. So every time this happened, I had to explain that no, I didn't use that term. I didn't use it because it wasn't used at the time. It was anachronistic. Nobody used that term as a style term in the 1920s or 30s or 40s or 50s, for that matter. And it was very imprecise, and it just seemed to me that it was just a term that shouldn't exist, and that we should do something else with that, period. So as I mentioned, it was not used in the 1920s, 30s, 40s. There was that fair in Paris, the Art Deco fair, but it wasn't used as a style label until the 1960s. And this is the man that popularized it, a gentleman named Bevis Hillier, who lived in London, still does actually, I think. He wrote this book in 1968. Curiously, it comes from England and not from France. And at the time, he could have called this a whole number of other things. There were 20 or 30 names that even he suggested might have been used. And I think that one of the striking things about this is that Paris came actually late to this party. If you want to look at the origins of what we now call Art Deco, it really comes more from Central Europe. And for example, from Vienna. And from architects, designers like this is Hoffmann. And you can see that these designs from the 1900s very much prefigure what you would see in the 1920s. So Hillier, though, I think he was fascinated by the image of Paris in the 1920s. He was living at the time, we're talking about 50s and 60s when he was in his mature years. He was living in London, which was very gray. This was the post-war years. There was just a tremendous amount of damage had been done, lots of problems, strikes. There was just no end of misery in London. And I think that Paris in the 1920s loomed as this great luxurious era before World War II. And so he named it Art Deco. after the 1925 fair in Paris, l'Exposition des Arts Décoratifs et Industriels Modernes, the decorative and industrial decorative and industrial arts. And of course, that was a fair that got a tremendous amount of attention because it was an attempt to be modern. Paris was in the vanguard at the time of this move to be modern, but notice that it's not the avant-garde modern of the Bauhaus. It's this very elegant modern. Now, in many ways, I think this name was very unfortunate because it meant that people would use it mostly for decorative and luxurious products. In fact, when it was called the Decorative Arts Fair, Art Decoratif didn't mean that it was just decorative or embellished. It was a category of art. It wasn't fine arts like painting or sculpture. It was decorative or applied arts. But because we got the name Art Decoratif, most people have associated with Art Deco, have associated it with decoration. And I think that's too bad because it is clearly a lot more than that. And also because of this name, people associate with Paris when I think it should be associated equally with what was happening in Brussels or in Vienna, or for that matter with Frank Lloyd Wright. So this idea took off particularly after 1968. It took off particularly in the 70s and the 80s. Hillier created this exhibition in Minneapolis, which sort of cemented the idea that it was French luxury products. But I think that the reason it took off in the 1980s was that there was a grassroots rebellion against the people who were trying to dictate what the good art and good architecture was. That was the people at the Museum of Modern Art that were saying that the good art is the minimal modernism of people like Mies van der Rohe and Gropius, and not this decorative stuff. So I think that this was a genuine grassroots reaction against that kind of puritanical, narrow definition of what ought to be modern. Because Art Deco, as seen here, is just as colorful and as exuberant as the Bauhaus was restricted and minimal. So this was, as I say, decidedly a bottom-up kind of revival, very different from most trends in art. And so you would have people like Andy Warhol collecting, just indiscriminately collecting a whole lot of Art Deco, both the popular products like these cookie jars, but also very expensive Ruhlmann furniture. And maybe some of you, if you were in Chicago in the 1970s, early 1980s, you would know some of these stores that were popping up in Chicago and elsewhere selling Art Deco, which was kind of at first a kind of underground taste, kind of camp meaning it's so bad it's good, and then people thinking, well, it's not bad at all, it's just good. And but it was a very slow process. Now, as it caught on, the definition of Art Deco expanded. I think early on, it was mostly objects, mostly design objects, teacups and saucers. But the US didn't really have a lot of this luxury French product. What it did have was architecture. So gradually, and particularly in the United States, the term got applied to architecture and especially to buildings like the Chrysler Building that had recognizable Art Deco detailing, like the elevator doors or those so-called gargoyles. And it started to become applied to buildings as a whole, not just the decorative elements. And originally, most people thought of this as 1920s, because that's when the fair was, but particularly in this country, it started to be used for the 1930s. And one of the big reasons for that was this phenomenon that happened in Miami Beach. A woman named Barbara Capitman had decided that the way to revive Miami Beach was to find people to restore these buildings from the 1930s, 1940s, even 1950s that were quite a different style. This was a streamlined style, but it followed very much in the same pattern as the 1920s. And what it had in common was that it was modern. It was definitely not a strict revival of any period. It was modern, but it never threw out the basics of proportion, ideas of beauty, and the need for ornament to explain what the building was about. In other words, this was part of the tradition that goes all the way back to Greece and Rome that the Bauhaus was trying to throw out. So with this, the 1930s joined the 1920s. Barbara Capitman would go around the country and she would proselytize on behalf of the Art Deco. And everywhere she went, little Art Deco societies formed, including in 1981, the one in Chicago, which then many 30 years afterwards started thinking about doing a book. And so we fast forward to 2012, when I first got involved in this project of doing a book. And this question about what would be in the book, how we would define Art Deco, created just an enormous number of fights. This is the editorial board that I convened with a lot of the people that did history of design, history of architecture. We finally decided, after a lot of battles, that it was going to be 1920s and 1930s, and it was going to be not just architecture, but it was going to be all kinds of design: product design, industrial design, graphic design, fashion design. Now, the problem here was that we knew something about the architecture, but almost nothing about most of these other topics. And it was very hard to find anyone. If you wanted to have someone write about the history of the radio, for example, you could get an academic, but they were going to tell you about the commercialization of how American corporations made people buy things they didn't need. Or you could talk to the people who collected the radios, and they could tell you what every tube in the radio did, but they couldn't tell you a thing about how it fit into the history of design generally. So this was just a tremendous slog, trying to collect the material and then trying to get people to write 800-word essay. That is the hardest thing to do ever. And you can get people to write 20 pages, but to get them to write 800 words that's nice and succinct and tells a story, that is a real problem. So here's what we ended up with: 100 objects, and we call these key designs, and they stretch from, what did we have here, 1916 to can't read there, the last one. And you can see that they just, if you can read them, I don't know if you can from back there, that there's about half of them are buildings, half of them are pieces of graphic design. And it was, a lot of these were things that had never really been published before at all. So it was just an eye-opener to all of us that these things existed. So we started here, and the very first entry is Frank Lloyd Wright. And it's pretty clear. I mean, Frank Lloyd Wright wanted everyone to believe that all of his ideas sprang full-blown from this genius brain. But actually, it's pretty clear that he was always looking at everything else that was going on. And in this case, Midway Gardens, I think he was looking a lot at Central Europe. He was looking at Austria and Germany. And pay attention to those so-called sprites, the sculptures that sit on that wall. You can see a little bit more of the sculpture there and the sprites that are on the corners. Now, these were done by Alfonso Iannelli. And what we don't know really is to what extent this extreme simplification, abstraction that you see in the buildings and the sculpture, to what extent that came from Wright, and to what extent it came from Iannelli. In fact, Wright always disputed that Iannelli even was the author of those. He said he designed them himself. In any case, these were marvelous things. Of course, Midway Gardens is gone now, but you folks had something very similar, done decades later, but very much in the same style, which is the Iannelli fountain. Well, two fountains actually, but Iannelli himself did this one at the upper right. There was an earlier design for it. I was just by there this afternoon, and I see that some of the pieces are still there, fountains and the little jets for the water. And just thinking about it, I probably shouldn't say these things because it's going to get me in trouble, but I couldn't help but think that this was the most remarkable piece of design in the city here, and just such a tragedy that it's now completely gone, because it's just remarkable. It's like really nothing else. Frank Lloyd Wright, as I say, wanted everyone to believe that this all came directly out of his own brain. But interestingly, you can see through his whole career that it traces almost the development of Art Deco that other people were doing. So from the so-called zigzag deco of the 1920s, that very spiky kind of deco that we've saw at the Midway Gardens, you get these streamlined forms in the 1930s. For example, here at Johnson Wax Company. Okay, now here we're looking at Marion Mahoney Griffin. And this is, again, very early for what we would call Art Deco, this highly abstracted, modern version, but doesn't completely remove all the historic precedents. Her husband, Walter Burley Griffin, and she both worked for Frank Lloyd Wright. And you look at this poster and you say to yourself, well, now, Walter Burley Griffin has always gotten all the attention. He did the capital of Australia at Canberra later in his career. But you look at this and you wonder, I wonder what Marion, her influence on him was, or on Wright. Where did all of this actually come together? Now, the French strain actually comes to Chicago a little bit later. So we don't see really much until the end of the 1920s. And this is a good example of the way it sort of arrived. Oh, I'm sorry about that date. It was in high fashion that it came. And this was a set of costumes created for a really curious woman named Ganowalska. She was a great diva, or would-be diva. She never really had a career, just very wealthy husbands. And she commissioned this work for an opera called Zaza by this French designer named Erte. I don't think it was ever used, but it shows you that there was this strong connection between women in the highest reaches of society in Chicago and Parisian fashion. And they knew about it, they bought it, they wore it in Chicago. So this is where that comes from. And then Chicagoans started to create fashion in the same mold. So here's an engagement dress for a woman that was part of that high society, coming from Blum's Vogue shop in 1926, a really pretty wonderful adaptation of French high fashion. This was a very small part of Chicago output, but it was quite brilliant for a few years. And now, curiously, very curiously actually, perhaps the most spectacular efflorescence of this was two companies out in Elgin, on the very far periphery of the Chicago area. And no one, I don't think, has ever understood exactly why this suddenly appeared in the late 1920s. These very high fashion French-inspired works, compact cases, cigarette lighters, and especially these watches, these Parisian watches. They had a direct connection with Paris. So if you look at ads it will tell you that they were designed by very well-known French designers, women like Madame Jenny, Madame Agnès, who was a hat maker, a modiste, and Madame Charlotte. But what did these French women actually do? Did they really design these, or did they just work up a sketch, send them to Elgin? How much of this is actually Paris and how much of it is Elgin, Chicago? In any case, it flourished for 3 or 4 years and then pretty much disappeared. So very, very curious, and we don't quite know how this happened. Now, Chicago certainly made an important contribution to architecture. It witnessed a burst of buildings at the late 1920s. For example, this spectacular apartment building in Hyde Park on the south side, this kind of abstraction and very fashionable ornamental detailing that could have come right out of Paris in the late 1920s. Here is the haunt of some of the major figures in Chicago society, and people have always ascribed these interiors to this woman, Rue Carpenter, who was an interior decorator, but she was one of the great lady decorators, and we don't really know what that means. Did she have an office? Did she have people that worked for her? Did she have a secretary? Or was it that she would go with the architect and point out the furniture and tell him what colors? Still don't have any real idea, but whatever the case, these are spectacular interiors at the Casino Club and still largely intact. This is right in the shadow of the Hancock building. Now, there were a lot of very remarkable theaters that were done in Chicago. Here's one out in Park Ridge. Again, we have Iannelli. Iannelli was just this master of all trades. He did painting and sculpture and all kinds of decorative arts. Some real surprises. This funeral parlor, somebody knew about this, but I certainly had never heard about it, but pretty remarkable. Some very suave apartment buildings of the late 1920s. Here's a pair by Philip Mayer with some just wonderful, sleek interiors by all sorts of people. For example, these interiors for John Root of Halliburton Root, and on the top, we're looking at one of the ones that was done. I think that one was done by Frances Elkins, who was the sister of David Adler, another very well-known residential architect in Chicago. So these, again, are buildings that are as sleek and as elegant as anything you would find in Paris. And this brings us back again to the Civic Opera building, and it introduces us then to one of the two largest commercial firms in Chicago in the 1920s and 1930s. This one was Graham, Anderson, Probst, and White. This was the descendant of the firm of Burnham and Root from the 19th century. And what was interesting was that the buildings in Chicago of the 1880s, 1890s were this was a kind of pioneer town still. Very few of those architects had formal training, except in engineering. By the 1920s, these were very cosmopolitan people, the people that worked at these large firms like Graham, Anderson, Probst, and White. Many of them studied at the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. And so they came back and they were able to use those ideas from the École des Beaux-Arts, but on a scale that was much larger than anything seen in Paris. So this was a skyscraper with this opera house at the base. And again, it was just inconceivable to me when I first saw this interior that this was not part of the history that everyone knew about the Chicago architecture, because it's just a brilliant creation. The whole theater is. And here we're looking at the interior with the mural work by an French-American named Jules Guérin. Just a brilliant creation, as important an interior as anything else in Chicago, or the country for that matter. The other great firm was the one that I was working on, and that was Holabird and Root. The Board of Trade building was in some ways the most conspicuous building in Chicago because it was at the end of LaSalle Street, the Wall Street of the Midwest. And this canyon just framed that building. It's in that setback mode that really was well, it's hard to know. In 1916, New York adopted a zoning code that required setbacks. Chicago had something like that, but I think that more than a result of the zoning code was that this made sense because it allowed you have large plates, floor plates at the lower level, and then smaller plates at the top, which gave you some variety, and it allowed light and air to get to the street. And so Chicago did this, and we'll see in a moment that cities all over the country did it, even when there was no zoning. So it became a kind of style. And here's this brilliant interior of, and you can see that it's moving from the 1920s to the 1930s with all of this sort of streamlining. I think the paradigmatic building was probably the Palmolive building because it had a free site at the north end of Michigan Avenue. You could see it from all around. Had a beacon at the top, which you would see as you flew into Chicago. Chicago was not in this period. I don't think it ever was really where design trends started. Design trends were more likely to start in Paris and New York and other places. But what Chicago did, and supremely well, was to take these ideas, standardize them, make them, figure out how to make them beautifully and enduringly, and then and make them palatable to the middle class, and then export these ideas all over the country. So I think this building is the building, the paradigm, not the Chrysler building or the Empire State Building. There weren't a lot of copies of the Chrysler building anywhere, but this building, the type that it introduces, you can see all across the country. There are little Palmolive buildings everywhere you look in this country, even in little towns where it really made no economic sense whatever to build a skyscraper. You still have a skyscraper because it was the hallmark of a cosmopolitan place. Some of these by Holabird, the Holabird firm, most of them not, most of them by other people, other firms, other local firms, including particularly a lot of them in the cities that are around Chicago, in the economic orbit of Chicago. So in Battle Creek, we have one by Holabird and Root. They're on the right-hand side, and they're on the left-hand side. On the right-hand side is a bank by Weary and Alfred. And until I started working on this lecture a few days ago, I knew really nothing about them. I knew the name, but didn't know much about them, and was just staggered to find that they had done at least 20 tall buildings, many of them bank buildings, all across the country. It must have been a very big office, including probably the two most notable buildings from this era in Kalamazoo. So the American National Bank here, a very good example of this style, although surprisingly, the interior somewhat more traditional than you might have expected. And then the City Hall with these wonderful pieces of relief sculpture. So this is a pretty remarkable set of two buildings by this firm, and I couldn't find anything really more about them except a list of some of these buildings. They're in the 19-teens, 1920s, up to about 1927. they were pretty much classical. Suddenly they switched to this Deco style, modern Deco style, and it must have been a very big, very important office, and yet they don't appear in, I couldn't find them in any of the books on Chicago architecture. Now, as I say, we also did graphic design and industrial design. It turns out that Chicago, once again, was not doing the very high-end products that you might see in a place like New York or Boston, but they were doing magazines like this. And these are pretty remarkable things. The dates of these are from the 1920s, late 1920s, early 1930s, and they are really extremely good examples of this streamlining that was coming into, and these had huge circulations, these magazines. And then in fashion. Now, this is obviously not Parisian haute couture. This particular one is Montgomery Ward, but Montgomery Ward and Sears, these were important places. These were the largest retailers in the world. So what they would do is they would send their scouts out to Paris, look at the new models that would come out every year, and then they'd figure out how to make these for, I can't read it there, like $1.99 for the American market. And so they could sell these by mail order to housewives on farms in Iowa. And this doesn't look like much to us now with all our Target stores everywhere, but really this was a remarkable thing in terms of the social life of the country. I think you could say that perhaps for the very first time in Western history, if you were walking down a sidewalk in Chicago or Kalamazoo and you saw a woman approaching you from 100 feet away, you couldn't tell whether this was the wife of a business executive or whether this was the wife of a farmer who had come into town to buy supplies, because they really were quite similar, although stripped down and very often in less fine materials. Once again, Chicago wasn't the place where these ideas started, and it was always looking at other places, and particularly in fashion, it was looking at Paris. So these Paris hats produced for $3.98 for the American audience. Now, as the 20s moved to the 30s, as I said, we started to see less of the kind of spiky designs of the 20s and more of the streamlining that started to take place. Once again, this didn't originate in Chicago. It originated with engineers, and usually for things that moved, like boats and airplanes, things of that sort. So we see it in Paris or in vehicles like this. We can already see it in the cascading forms of the Board of Trade. I think it was introduced to America most notably at the 1933 Century of Progress exhibition in Chicago. And we're looking here at probably the most striking example. This didn't come until the second year of that fair in 1934, but the Chrysler Building really epitomized that streamlined style, seen here in this wonderful photograph by Hedrick Blessing. Hedrick Blessing got its start in the 1933 fair and became the great Chicago photographer of architecture for the next several decades. Now, here was one of our great discoveries. This was a man named Everett Worthington. His name had totally disappeared from memory in Chicago, but one of our authors found a surviving daughter who had a lot of the archive, and from that we found out that he designed a lot of the most important exhibition spaces in the 1933 fair, and he was just about to perform a similar role in the New York Fair of 1939, but he died young, tragically. And the family members didn't really do anything much with his legacy. So this is somebody that now, because the archives have gone to the Hagley Museum in Delaware, people will be able to learn more about. But this is a pretty remarkable thing, this fountain of Coca-Cola at that fair. Now, some of the designs were obviously very elegant, high-end. This is a woman named Helen Hughes Delaney, who, until we came across her name, I think was, again, all but unknown. She only practiced for 2 or 3 years. I think her husband whisked her off to California, and that was the end of that. But this is something that would have been completely at home in Paris in the years that she did it. And here's something that's even more avant-garde, because Chicago would occasionally do things that were for a very refined taste. If you look at this, you can just imagine a Brancusi or an Arp. And they didn't sell many of these. It was this strange device. It was commissioned by an industrialist who was worried about the safety of his children, so wanted to have this microphone thing I guess this is the speaker part of it, in the living room, and a little microphone in the children's room so they could tell if there was any disturbance there. As I say, it hardly sold any of these because it was very expensive and it was hard to make, but it's just a beautiful object that looks more like it ought to be in a museum than sold in the Zenith line. So in architecture, there was a great simplification, a lot of wrapping around corners. Here's a factory out in the west suburbs. Theaters were very often the place where you saw this new streamlined style. Here's one in Oak Park. Department stores increasingly relied on air conditioning and no windows because they were detrimental to the merchandise inside. Here's a store just on the border of River Forest and Oak Park, unfortunately now gone. Sometimes it was more rectilinear, but similar in many ways, but more straight-edged and rectilinear. So this is a school in the south suburbs. But to our surprise, it seemed that the real story here might not be so much with architecture as it was with product design. Now, by the 1930s, by 1933, for example, we were right in the middle of the Depression, and you would think that there would be very little that was new or coming on the market, but either in spite of or maybe because of the Depression, there was a very fast move toward much more modern, not avant-garde, but modern products. Here's one of them. This toaster became one of the best-selling appliances ever produced. It was done by an in-house designer. The designers whose names we know almost all came from New York, people like Raymond Loewy, and they were known because they had their own practice, and so they advertised themselves. In Chicago, most often, it was designers like George Scharfenberg at Sunbeam, who was an in-house designer. And Sunbeam didn't advertise the fact that this was done by Scharfenberg. We only know this usually from the patents and who took out the patents. But this toaster is the perfect distillation of function and this new streamlining aesthetic. And as I said, this really revolutionized ordinary middle-class living. So modernism came into the house first through the movies, courtesy of Hollywood, then through the garage, courtesy of Detroit, and the kitchen. And that was really the realm in which Chicago played a really important part. So, for example, this Sears cold spot refrigerator designed by the famous New York designer Raymond Loewy, was an attempt to create a low-cost refrigerator, the cold spot, which would compete with the higher-priced brands that were already out there. And this really, once again, it's hard to imagine the impact of this. We're in the middle of the Depression. Most people out in the rural America didn't have electricity, and so it was very hard to keep food fresh in summer. But with rural electrification and then this low cost of the cold spot refrigerator, even in the height of the Depression, sales just skyrocketed, and it changed the life of the American family in ways that were very profound. The same was true with the Sunbeam Mixmaster, that this saved hours and hours of hard labor by women in America's kitchen. So pervasive was the influence of these Chicago products that you can see on a cover by Norman Rockwell. You can see that Sunbeam toaster sitting there on the table. That's probably a dinette set created by the Howell Company in St. Charles, Illinois. And it's probably a Chicago coffee pot on the stove. So by the end of the 1930s, these Chicago products had just permeated the country and could be seen in kitchens everywhere. I'm sure a lot of you these are very familiar objects. Now, Kalamazoo probably had a lot of designs from the same era in the same style. Almost impossible for somebody from Chicago to figure out what they were or what they looked like. It would actually be probably pretty hard here to find these. Here's one example. It's quite a bit more conservative than most of the ones I've been showing. These little Chippendale legs, for example. But you can see that it's starting to get the curved streamlining, and the handles are actually very much in the 1930s sort of streamlined style. So I think that it would be quite possible to write a similar book on Art Deco Kalamazoo, but I warn anybody, and I hope somebody in the room might do that, but I warn you, it will take an enormous amount of research just to find these objects, let alone figure out who designed them and when. And I think that this is the kind of history we need, because why should art history be only about the things that appealed and were bought by the richest and most famous people in the world? Why shouldn't art history be about the objects that came into all of our houses? A democratic art history, not an art history. The Marxists said they were going to democratize art history, but they really went right back to the classics of high art history and just tried to talk about their social impact. Well, why not the story of these things? So back to Chicago. So in the 1930s, Chicago could claim just a remarkable roll call of national design icons. The Bell telephone, for example, for decades, this was the only real telephone option that you had in America. It was made at the Western Electric plant in Chicago and neighboring Cicero. This was brought this miracle of instant communication to much of the country. The Radio Flyer Company with their wagons. The Schwinn Company and bicycles, this spectacular black Phantom of 1949. Iconic fans. Chicago had 5 or 6 of fan companies. Radios. Here's this Motorola radio that it was so difficult to find anyone to write 800 words about. But what a spectacular object, isn't it? Plumbing fixtures, microphones, Panthers by Royal Hickman. These first, and then the television lights after that. And finally, two designs that were favorites of many of us that were working on this book. As I said, this was a big cast of characters. There were over 40 authors, and we had a little working group of people that were doing the editing and the image rights and reproductions. The Sears air compressor. Now, it was symptomatic that when we went to the Chicago History Museum, because Chicago History Museum was going to do an exhibition on some of the same material, but when I went to the Chicago History Museum, I found that there was almost nothing from Sears, despite the fact that Sears was one of the greatest stories of Chicago history. They had no clothes from Sears from this period. They had 20 gowns by Madeleine Vionnet from Paris, but nothing from what Sears produced. And they certainly didn't have anything like this, the Sears compressor. And this was so remarkable because, first of all, it's so basic, it's so simple, but with kind of simple geometry, the brilliant color, so that the form was spectacular, but it was also a spectacular innovation because with this compressor, a single individual, a homeowner, a small contractor could go out and paint a house in the time it would have taken before several days. They could do it in several hours. So it combined this new style and a really magnificent example of it with a great deal of utility. And then let's end with this one, the Hostess Twinkie. This idea had been around. It had been used for strawberry shortcake, where they would, in season only, they would take the strawberries and somehow inject them into a form like this. But in 1930, James Alexander Dewar, not a household name for sure, invented the modern Twinkie and figured out a way to inject this cream into the Twinkie shape. Now, the people sitting around our table were divided about this. There were those who said, well, this is absolutely ridiculous. This can't come out of a mold. And so it was obvious that this shape was going to be easier to get out of the mold than some more complicated shape. On the other hand, there were those of us who said, well, yes, but if they really, if that was all that it was, they would have done something to disguise that. They would have sprinkled chocolate or something on top of it to gussy it up a little bit. They apparently really liked that form. Anyway, I don't know which it really is, and we put it in the book, and we're waiting to see what people would say, and they've come down on various sides about it. It'll be interesting to hear what you think about it. And I thank you very much for your attention, and happy to answer any questions that anyone might have. Anybody in here ready to start the movement to recreate that fountain in Bronson Park? Yeah, please.
Something that strikes me is the lighting that is being utilized to accent the forms, and wondered how that became integrated into the architectural firms. Did they have lighting designers?
Yes, good question. A question about lighting on these buildings, and I don't know entirely the answer to that. There had been lighting on buildings going back to the 1893 fair and to the invention of the incandescent bulb. Mostly that lighting would either just flood the whole front of a building or would be like a little string of lights that outlined the building. What happened in the 1930s was that they took advantage of those setbacks in order to put the lighting on the setbacks and then wash up the buildings. And I don't think there were well-known lighting designers after World War II, but I don't think that was a an actual profession before World War II. I think that the lighting companies, GE and so on, had people that consulted, but I think it was, I think a lot of this was just seat of the pants trying to figure out how to do it. But yeah, it's a good question. And you can see that these forms, which became three-dimensional for the first time because the earlier buildings had been blocks, because they became three-dimensional, then it meant that it was really a great thing to use the lighting to emphasize that at night. So it became, through all the American cities, it became the sort of hallmark of modernity, this view at night of the Palmolive building with the light coming up the side, and then the beacon that went around and illuminated for miles in every direction. Yeah, it's an integral part of the story, and we didn't do as much on that as we should have. Yeah, the Lindbergh Beacon. Yes, sir.
If David Rose were here, he could tell you a lot better than I could about the whole story of the fountain, but it would take another whole meeting. The problems and what we all did to try to save the fountain and reinterpret it. It's in storage.
I was amazed when I walked by the panel they have, which, I mean, this is real. This is so classic. You just wonder who could have written this. It says, in 2016, this fountain was put on the National Register of Historic Places. In 18, it was demolished. Something like that. This is just hilarious. That it was like the contradiction was right there on that panel. Yes, back.
On a happier note, the old Merchants Bank in Battle Creek has been beautifully restored and turned into a mixed-use building with apartments and retail space. It's a gorgeous restoration.
Yes, it's been very impressive going around Kalamazoo, but also Battle Creek, that so much of many of these buildings have survived because other cities haven't been so lucky. Almost all these buildings, when they become middle-aged, start to look dirty and old-fashioned to people, and there's this temptation to slap on a new facade or take them down and build something else. But a lot of these skyscrapers in smaller cities seem to have survived because they're really the very symbol of the city. That's what they were built for, and they remain that way today. Yes.
You didn't mention the Fisher Building in Detroit. Was that Art Deco?
I didn't mention the what building?
The Fisher Building in Detroit.
Oh, Fisher Building in Detroit. Yeah, Detroit, because Detroit was building so much and so fast in the 1920s. It was the fastest growing city in America, along with Los Angeles. It has a bigger collection of these than almost any other place. And the Fisher Building, the Penobscot Building, there are like 6 of them that are really spectacular examples of this Art Deco style. And fortunately, I think most of those buildings have fared, I haven't been there in a number of years, but I think most of those buildings have, at least from the outside, have fared pretty well. Yes.
Ian Ellie also did lots of appliances.
Yes, he did.
There's something.
Yeah, Ian Ellie had this enormously long career and did everything imaginable. I think I said that he did painting and sculpture and worked for several companies designing appliances. I think Ian Ellie did the logo for that Sunbeam toaster that I showed, and he was even at work after World War II. Some of you know the Prudential Building in Chicago, that great Rock of Gibraltar relief on the facade of it. That's an Ian Ellie from after World War II.
What about the SMEG appliances? Were they from that period or they came later?
I'm sorry, what about the what? The
SMEG.
SMG?
SMEG.
Oh, you mean the current manufacturer?
Are they reproduction
They're not from this period. Those are recent, and they are very clever adaptations of that style for today, and very expensive too. Does anyone have one? Does everyone know what we're talking about? The refrigerators, particularly. I don't know what else they make, but these. Oh, do they have a full line of appliances? Yeah. What kind of company is this? Is this Korean, maybe? Oh, okay. Yeah, these are really beautiful refrigerators, other appliances within that streamlined style, and in brilliant colors that didn't exist, couldn't have been produced in the 1920s and 30s. Anything else? Well, thank you all very much for coming.